welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you today on WJOPLP Newburyport at FM 96.3 on Channel 9 and on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I am just so delighted to welcome back to the show this morning Leslie Landrigan. She's a return visitor. She was here once to talk about Newburyport's own fascinating, eccentric Lord, that's in quote marks, Timothy Dexter, and again to talk about Bar Harbor, Babylon, a book she co-wrote with her husband Dan about the wealthy eccentrics who used to summer in the Maine resort town. The Landrigans maintain the New England Historical Society website, which is full of fascinating narratives from New England's history. She's here today to talk about her and Dan's newest book, Love Stories from History, the lives and loves of Puritans, poets, pioneers, peers, soldiers, a president, and a magician. Love Stories presents the lives and loves of legendary Americans spanning 350 years, from Puritan poet Anne Bradstreet through Mark Twain to baseball great Jackie Robinson. So first of all, Leslie, welcome and thank you so much for coming back to the morning show.
Thank you for having me, Mary.
Oh, it's always fun to talk to you. It's always full of good stories, Leslie. So
that's what we live for.
Yes, we do. Well, Leslie, first of all, how did you and Dan come up with the idea to compile Love Stories from History?
Well, we've been publishing our website for 11 years.
Wow, congrats.
And I know, it does not seem possible. But we realized we had a whole bunch of good love stories, and I think we were thinking, oh, Valentine's Day. Is there a book that people might want to read for Valentine's Day? And we realized we had all these great love stories. And so we chose these because there was enough information to turn them into sort of fictionalized, give them a fictional
narratives,
treatment.
Yeah.
So, you have settings and you have emotions and dialogue and, all those things that go into a romantic. And in some cases, they were pretty comic.
Yeah.
In some, they were tragic.
But a lot of them are full on soap opera worthy versions, very cinematic. So, well, Leslie, I'm curious to find out about let's call them courtship rituals, because they were different from the ones people use now. No dating apps. And I'm curious about, as you research these love stories, what were some of the courtship rituals you learned about, and what struck you as, gee, that was a good idea, or oh, I'm glad we don't do that anymore? What was constraining or perhaps liberating to romantic pursuits? There was, for example, lots of calling upon mentioned, and lots of pretty florid and sometimes pretty plaintive love letters.
Yes. Well, one of the things that has not changed from Anne Bradstreet in 1630 to Jackie Robinson in 1940 is the person who was doing the courting had to pass inspection.
Yes.
They had to visit the family. In the case of Jackie Robinson, Rachel's mother loved him. Her father didn't, but her mother ruled the roost. And in the case of Samuel Sewell, the witch trial judge who could not get a date, he was in his 60s, and he didn't have parents. But what he did have was his friends and his peers. And so before he went after somebody, he checked around to make sure she was okay. So that has pretty much stayed the same. The other thing is the gift giving. That seems to have stayed pretty much the same, although the gifts are very, very different. Samuel Sewell, the Puritan witch trials judge, gave his lady loves shoe buckles, books of psalms, sermons. Yeah, wow.
It'd be a very select, smaller audience that might go with the belt buckles and the Book of Psalms today, I think.
Yeah.
Might be there, but small.
Well, I haven't quite figured out, but for some reason, shoe buckles were a big deal back then. But then you get to Jackie Robinson, and he gave Rachel his varsity ring. So, you have to give someone something special. You're right. There was a lot of people didn't seem to go on dates. No, they didn't go on dates. They would call on someone at home, and until maybe the 20th century. Yeah, they just, they ran into each other at work, or the guy would call on the woman at home, and that was pretty much the way it was done for a very long time.
And of course, it's easy for us to forget today how much more complicated and time-consuming travel was.
Oh, God, yeah.
And so, thus I think probably, love letters factor in a number of your stories. And they seem to have played a significant role in the courtship.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, although the love letters gave us something to write about. So, people who didn't write love letters, they weren't going to make it into our book, probably.
No. Or maybe not into actual partnership.
Right, exactly.
Well, Leslie, there's so many wonderful stories in your book, but we agreed let's focus on two today. Two of the particularly, let's say, operatic stories.
Yes.
That of Alexander. And go ahead.
Newburyport adjacent.
Newburyport adjacent, that's right. One of them
Yes.
was Alexander Scammel, and the other is Nathaniel Hawthorne. And let's start with Alexander Scammel, back in Revolutionary War times. And I was thinking as I read his chapter, there's that famous saying from Sex and the City, popularized, I think somebody even wrote a book with the title, "He's just not that into you." So I think Alexander Scammel needed somebody credible to say, "She's just not that into you," and that could have been the title of the chapter on him.
It could have been. Well,
tell us about his claim to fame.
Well, Alexander Scammel, I would have liked to have known Alexander Scammel, and there's something I probably should have mentioned. We probably should have put into the book, which is that his father died. His father was a doctor. He grew up in Mendon. And his father was a doctor and died when he was 6. And so he and his brother were put into the household of a local minister. And I get the feeling from reading his letters that he was always looking for a father figure.
Oh, interesting.
And so anyway, Scammel goes to Harvard. He does, he surveys. He's a school teacher. That's what they did back then. And then he studied law in Durham, New Hampshire, with John Sullivan, who became a general and one of Washington's big generals, and later governor of New Hampshire. And when the war broke out, Sullivan got a commission as a general, and Alexander Scammel got a commission as a major. And this is during the siege of Boston. So they go from New Hampshire down to the outskirts of Boston, where they've got the British bottled up. And Alexander Scammel, he has some business with John Bishop, who is a wealthy merchant in what was then Mystic and is now Medford. And Bishop made him feel at home, and he entertained them. He was very engaging. He was tall. He was handsome. He was funny. He was outgoing. And he fell in love with their daughter, Abigail, who he called Nabby. And over time, he found a lot of excuses to visit Miss Nabby, and she agreed to marry him. And her father approved. And but then he had to go away. He had to go to Canada, and he wrote her letters and she responded, but he started to detect a little bit of frost. And then he pressed his case a little further and said, will you marry me? And she said no. She said, not as long as you're in the Army. And he was really torn because, I sense this father figure issue where he was taken into Washington's inner circle, and he was said to be the only person who could make Washington laugh.
Oh.
And he also very much loved being a member of the Bishop household. But he's really torn, does he give up the Army for her or not? And he doesn't. But he makes an extraordinary effort to see her during the winter when they were in Morristown. And I guess that's 77, 78. That was way worse than Valley Forge. It was just an awful, awful time. It was a really cold winter, and the men mutinied. And he rode his horse from New Jersey in this biting, bitter cold. There were no bridges. You had to get a boat to cross the rivers. You had to sleep in barns or with farmers or in skanky taverns. And he did all that to see her. And she's like, no, sorry. You got to leave the Army. And in her defense, I think she'd seen a lot of the war. She could see the Battle of Bunker Hill from her house, and people in Medford were terrified that there were constant rumors that the British were going to invade. And she knew somebody who'd been badly injured, maybe killed in the Boston Massacre. She knew somebody who had been killed, someone her own age, who'd been killed at the Battle of Lexington. And I think she just didn't have much appetite for the gore and for war. So Scammel went on, and I think he was sort of a great unsung hero. There were two battles where the troops were flagging. One was the Battle of Princeton, and one was the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse, where the troops are getting beat, and he rides up on his white stallion and he rallies the troops. And George Washington was behind him, and not, as history records, Washington rode up. It was Scammel. He was,
he was the front line.
Brave.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, the story is that, he was killed in a scouting expedition just before Yorktown. And it was said that Abigail, she later married. She didn't marry until she was in her 30s. And she married an older doctor, and she was related to they related to John Adams. Her mother was Abigail Adams' cousin, and so one of the Adams wrote to the other. I think she basically married the guy for money, but which by the way, Alexander Scammel didn't have any, so there's that. But she kept his letters until she died. So
yes. Which is how he got a chapter in your book.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Well, Leslie, reading the chapter about him, I was struck by the privations, is the word I used, that he had to go through, that you just described, riding through the snow.
Oh, yeah.
Not just once, but more than once, because it takes a lot of devotion to deal with winter. He and his horse both went through tremendous privations to journey from the front lines of the Revolutionary War back to Medford to visit with her. And this didn't happen just once, but you recollect, how many times did he ask her he got the same answer each time.
Yeah, and he asked her to marry him at least 6 times.
Yeah.
And he was so desperate, too. At one point, he wrote to her and said, you really need to marry me. It's, you got to do it. It's, you need to do it for your country. And if you don't answer, I'm just going to take that as a yes. So it suggests he was a little bit out of his mind. Yeah. And finally, he wrote to her father and didn't hear back from her father. And he, it was very sad.
Well, it is sad because, I understand that she might have been concerned, having seen people die, that she would marry him and he'd go off and die in the war, leaving her a widow. But I also, what struck me, what seemed there was tremendous pathos to this story, is the conflict between choosing between the woman you love and your duty to the Revolutionary War, to liberating America and
Yeah.
becoming the founder. And he had a heroic role in the revolution. Thank you very much, Alexander Scammel.
Yeah, well,
but
yeah,
and,
and
nobody knew at the time that we were going to win.
Right.
So there was a
Nobody
lot
thought we
on
were
the
gonna
line.
win.
So that's really
Yeah.
a pathos to the conflict between. He clearly was. I think the word obsessed is fair enough to use
Oh,
for
yeah,
his feelings
definitely.
about her, and yet
Yeah.
he persisted. He never gave up.
Well, you wonder too if he's going through the war. It's not a lot of fun,
Yeah.
and this dream of the perfect home and happiness and his beloved Miss Nabby. If that kind of sustained him during the war.
Oh, yeah.
But
That makes total sense. A dream
Yeah.
to hold on to give him hope and
Yeah.
a reason to keep going.
yeah.
Well, I'm
He
curious.
was very devoted to Washington, by the way, and Washington was said to have cried when he heard that he died,
Ah.
which he didn't do very often. But.
Well, apparently, Alexander Scammel was one of the few people who could make him laugh and cry. So
Yeah, there you
that
go.
suggests a close connection between the two of them.
Yes.
Sort of.
Yes.
I'm curious to find out. I mean, she said no to him over and over and over again. She knew her own mind. She wound up marrying somebody else. Why do you think she kept his letters?
That is a really good question. And maybe she really did love him, but she didn't think he would be a good match. It may just have been what she said. I don't want, you've got to quit the Army. Maybe she didn't want to be, maybe she did love it. I suspect she was very conflicted. And I think she probably had strong feelings for him. And then there was also the war. He was a war hero. She had this connection with the war hero. And people, after a time, they tended to, what's the word I'm looking for? They tended to really admire and put the Revolutionary War veterans on a pedestal. So that may have something to do with it.
Yeah.
Her letters are I don't think those have survived. I couldn't find them. But so we may never know. The inscrutable Miss Nabby.
Well, that's part of what makes a good love story intriguing.
Yes.
An element of mystery that remains.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
You can infer the passions, but some secrets remain forever. So.
Yes, forever buried.
Well, let's talk about Nathaniel Hawthorne then, because first off, may I say, who knew that he was known for being even handsomer than Lord Byron? And we do have a picture of him that we'll insert so people can see. He was he was a beautiful young man. Who knew? I didn't know.
He really was.
I'm more familiar with older pictures of him when he's got a mustache and, handsome for the times, but in a different kind of handsome than people would swoon over him today.
Oh, yeah, yeah. He knew it, too. He knew it. He would, even though he was shy and, let's face it, weird, he would, he knew that he looked good in a white collar and a black cape, and he always went out in his, dashing outfit.
He dressed for effect.
Yes.
So, well, he also, was morose and haunted by his family connection to Salem witch trials Judge Hawthorne. And he spent 12 reclusive years in a garret, which I also didn't know. It's been a long time since I was an English major and read the Scarlet Letter or knew these details. Now, spending 12 years in a garret doesn't, and being morose, it doesn't initially sound like it has the makings of a big love story. But the Peabody sisters, the famous three Peabody sisters, changed his life when they moved to Salem. So tell us about, because, they're maybe not that as well known today, but there have been books written about they were prominent in 19th century New England and in Boston history. So tell us about them.
Recent.
Yeah.
There were three. There was Elizabeth, the oldest, Lizzie. Mary, the middle one, and Sophia, the baby. They had, it was kind of funny. The family, there were 6 kids in the family, 3 girls and 3 boys. Their mother was a school teacher. She was a dynamic woman. Their father was a dentist, not so dynamic. And the sisters were all very accomplished. The brothers, let's face it, they were losers. And so the sisters kind of had to go off on their own. They probably would have done it anyway. But Elizabeth and Mary were very involved in the Transcendentalist movement. They were friends with Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. They were abolitionists, reformers. They were temperance fighters. They were for women's rights, but they're most identified with education. And Elizabeth and Mary started what was the first, if not one of the first kindergartens in the United States. And they wrote a bunch of books. They were very influential. Elizabeth, Lizzie, and Mary lived at one point in a boarding house in Boston. They were teaching. And there they met Horace Mann, who was the great education reformer, women's rights advocate, etc. And Mary, they both fell for Horace Mann. And he was grieving because his wife had just died. And so he kind of pushed them away, but he was friends with them. And Sophia, the youngest, was an invalid, and it may have been because her father was a dentist and may have treated her with mercury chloride, which is what they did, it basically poisoned people.
Yeah.
And she became an artist at one point. She moved to Boston. I think, I know, she went to see a doctor who said, quit lying on your fainting couch, get out, get some exercise, get some fresh air, which she did, and she improved. And Lizzie took control of her career and pushed her into taking art commissions. And she would paint copies of paintings, which is what they did back then. It was, 1840s. So the sad thing about poor Lizzie, who fell in love with Horace Mann, only Mary got him, and she fell in love with Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Sophia got her. So, I mean, she's definitely always bridesmaid. I think she terrorized men, She was very forward, shall we say.
So, but incredibly smart and very capable, and probably intimidating, because she was defying expectations for women of the time, both in terms of her accomplishments and her intelligence, and the force of her personality. I mean, because I think that she was also, she was really helpful to Hawthorne in his career, if I'm remembering correctly. Because she had connections with, I guess the Peabody sisters today, we would call them Uber influencers.
Oh, yeah,
Fair
definitely.
enough.
Definitely.
And so...
Yeah, definitely. Well, that, I think, is, and this story is often told wrong, but the thing to understand about Nathaniel Hawthorne was his father died when he was young, and Uncle Robert took care of the family, his mother and his 2 younger sisters. And there is some speculation that Uncle Robert was gay and may have made an approach to Nathaniel, because Nathaniel never liked him, never said anything good about him. He did, give him a place to live for most of his life or most of his young life, and sent him to Bowdoin. And at Bowdoin, his friends were Franklin Pierce, who became president of the United States, and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And I think it may have killed him that he went back to this house. And by the way, the house is still there. I went by it the other day. It's on Herbert Street, around the corner from the Hawthorne Hotel.
Oh, okay.
And and it's kind of triple deckerish looking, it's the big blocky. And so he moved back there. His mother lived there, his sisters lived there, there was an old servant, and there were apparently cousins, in and out, various, and they were weird. The sister Elizabeth never went out during the day, and they're all recluses.
Vampiric.
Yeah, exactly. They ate in their rooms. It was. They were. I mean, I think they were just kind of viewed as the neighborhood weirdos, and he actually didn't live there the whole time. Uncle Robert moved them to another house at one point, but then he did move back. Hawthorne called it Castle Dismal.
Oh.
And he was struggling. He wanted to be a famous writer like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow.
Yeah.
And he wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote, Haunted, and a lot of this was about the witch trials and the decay of Salem and magic and, the burden of the past and all that stuff. He started to get his stories published in the local paper, like, the Salem Gazette. And I think he wrote to Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. He's really desperate to make a name for himself. He dates a woman named Mary Silsby, who was bad news. She was rich. Her father had been a senator. She got him in trouble. She claimed that he had done something, like he had insulted her womanhood or something. And
oh my!
He hadn't. And,
God forbid.
Yeah, I know. But his sister Elizabeth had gone to school with Lizzie Peabody.
Okay.
And so one day they showed up at the Peabody sisters' door, and
they called upon them.
Yes, exactly. And the house is in Salem. It's walking distance, and it's being renovated right now. So apparently it was a very extremely awkward meeting. But they kept up the friendship, and Lizzie just really loved him. And he didn't even meet Sophia until later, after he'd been visiting Lizzie. And apparently there was a real chemistry between them. She had headaches all the time, but when he came to the door, her headaches disappeared.
Okay.
Yeah, and when he first saw her, he acted like he'd been jolted by lightning, so they really had a chemistry between them. But he was a bit of a cad and strung this woman, Mary Silsby, along and strung Lizzie along. And the word in Salem was, oh, he's engaged, but to whom? Was it to Mary or was it to Lizzie? Yeah. And
one of the interesting stories about Hawthorne, and it may follow the cad narrative, is the way that he let Lizzie know that he was going to marry her little sister, Sophia. Could you tell us about he didn't let her know directly. Could you tell us about the story he wrote to get the message across?
That was so nasty. He had a paper. He knew that they were going to go to Boston. They were going to take the train to Boston on January 1st. And he must have known that they took the paper. He had a story published about, it was an allegory about this was January 1st, the new year and the old year. And the new year, it was just a little story. The new year was, they were sisters. And the new year was young and fresh and had a basket of flowers and was happy and gay. And the old year was not so much.
Yeah.
And had these old moldy love letters that, were irrelevant, I guess. So it was really clear what this was about.
Yeah.
He didn't tell Lizzie.
Not
and
that subtle.
Oh God, I think it was an awful thing to do. I really do.
It was mean. It was cruel and cowardly. I think must be the
yes.
force behind
I
it.
think
It's really
so too.
cowardly.
Although Yeah, although where was Sophia this whole time, you know?
Yeah.
Although I think maybe Lizzie scared her to death.
Well,
So,
maybe. Yeah.
yeah,
So,
yeah. So anyway, they were engaged for 3.5 years. He couldn't afford to get married. And finally, he was always looking for a job. He was always looking for, always using his connections to get somewhere, which, you know, I guess we all do.
yeah.
But he got a job as, I think Franklin Pierce helped him get a job as a customs inspector, which was kind of a, you know, a patronage job where you didn't have to work very hard, so he could write. And he did get a job as a diplomat to consul to Liverpool, which through his friend Franklin Pierce. And he was actually, you know, I think he and Sophia had a very happy marriage. They had 3 kids, and someone said that, you know, it was the happiest household he ever knew. They lived in Concord with Thoreau and Emerson and all those people. I think Emerson helped him out. He's always getting helped out. But I guess he was a poor writer, so what can you do?
Well, it is such a dramatic story because it has so many twists and turns, and so many aspects of his character that come through, and it changes. I mean, they, you know, from what you were just saying and what I read in your book, they appear to have had a very happy marriage. So, you know, good for them.
Yeah.
And you know, I mean, he couldn't have known the illustrious place in American literary history that he holds today, but that would have just sent him, he would have been beside himself. I can't imagine. He would have been thrilled. Because people know him more than they know Franklin Pierce today.
Oh, yeah, yeah. They all have to read Scarlet Letter in English.
That's right.
You know, he's kind of an interesting contradiction because I think he was fiercely ambitious, but yet he was very shy and retiring. And he would, you know, use his connections. But then in the end, Franklin Pierce was an incredibly unpopular president in New England because he enforced the Fugitive Slave Act and he signed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which were just anathema in New England. And Hawthorne stayed loyal to him. He wrote a book about England, and he dedicated it to Franklin Pierce. And Emerson wouldn't, I think he tore it out, or, I mean, he was just disowned by the literary community, but he stuck with Pierce, and they went hiking in the White Mountains once when he was about 56 or so. And Franklin Pierce discovered his body.
Oh, my.
Yeah.
Oh.
So it's odd that he was, you know, such a cad to women, and yet he was so loyal to men. And I guess maybe he figured, well, it's just dating, you know. I assume he was, you know.
Well, and, you know, Cad, you know, he must have had some charm about him to have had such loyal friends.
I think so.
So there must have been something, perhaps, that they were able to see, that they that they were loyal to him and they wanted to help him, and they did. You know, so I'm curious to find out, though, what happened to Lizzie?
Oh, wow. She went on to, you know, like a force of nature, doing what she did. She never got married. She started a kindergarten. I think she went out west. She and Mary. Something I don't know much about, but it fascinates me, that there was a big Indian rights movement after the Civil War, and Lizzie and Mary were involved in that. And they had they got a woman. I think she was a Paiute. They got her published.
Oh.
She had a school. She had a very successful school. As a matter of fact, her school taught Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's wife.
Oh.
was for very wealthy, progressive people. She wrote books. There was actually a settlement house. I don't think it's still there in Boston, called the Elizabeth Peabody Settlement House, which is where Leonard Nimoy learned to act. So she
isn't
kind
that
of gave us
interesting?
Mr. Spock. Yeah.
So influencers at the time and throughout history.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and
She was a
that's
big deal.
a good legacy for her to have. And there's, some compensation in that historically.
Yes.
So, well, Leslie, let's see. Thank you so much. I think we've
you're
run out of
welcome.
time for today, but it's always so much fun to talk to you. You're a really good storyteller, and I
Well,
think
thank you.
you have the cover of your book there. Why don't you hold that up for people?
Right.
Love stories from history, and
You can see Henry Wadsworth Longfellow
with his heart-shaped, very mod glasses.
Yes, exactly.
And also, of course, you have the New England Historical Society website, which
Right.
people can check out, and it has information there about all of your books, and just a wealth of essays on all sorts of characters from New England history, from Lord Timothy Dexter to Mark Twain to pretty much everybody. So
Yeah, we kind of cover the waterfront.
You
I
do.
Guess the weirder, the more intrigued we are by it. So,
which makes for great stories. It strikes
thank
me,
you.
Leslie, as we're finishing today's interview, that there have been, film versions of the Scarlet Letter. But I don't know why nobody has picked up on the life history of a biographical film about Nathaniel Hawthorne, because it is
know.
downright operatic. So you and Dan
Oh.
should come up with a treatment.
We should work
That's
on
my
it.
suggestion, because I think
Well, you can.
Go
Yeah,
ahead.
you can walk around Salem right now, and it's very evocative.
Absolutely.
The street looks a lot.
That's right.
The same.
That's right. And it would be, it's just just stories within stories within stories. So that's my suggestion to you.
All right. I'll go tell Dan.
Okay. Thank you so much, Leslie. It's always fun to talk
Thanks,
to
Mary.
you.
It's
Come back
always fun to be on the show.
anytime. If there's something,
thank you.
You come across some engaging story and just call Mary and we'll have you back. Thank you
I
so
will.
much.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for today, everybody. Please join us again next Thursday at 9 for the morning show. Until then, everybody, be well. Bye now.